Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space.
Today's episode is about something that sounds deceptively simple, which is how we can make more of what people need, how we can build more houses, how we can create more public infrastructure, how we can innovate more in clean energy. And all of that might sound obvious, but I do think that so much of modern politics is built on the opposite assumption, that everything worth fighting for is scarce. For example, so many people fight over whether or not they can afford a house because housing is scarce. Energy is scarce. Public infrastructure, medical care, all of it is finite, and therefore all of it is the subject of zero-sum fights over who deserves what and why. But the thesis of today's episode is that many of those fights are often avoidable. Maybe the scarcity isn't natural. Maybe that scarcity of housing, that scarcity of energy, that scarcity of public infrastructure, you name it, maybe a lot of that scarcity is artificial. And maybe we can get rid of that scarcity just by building more. And that is at the heart of today's conversation with Steve Teles, a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. In today's episode, we dive deep into the intellectual foundation of something called the abundance agenda. Now, in simple terms, abundance is like supply-side liberalism. Abundance is the belief that we don't need to just divide a fixed pie more equitably. If we want to give people more pie, don't just divide it into the fairest slices possible. Instead, just figure out how to bake more pie so that there can be more pie available for everyone. And that's how I would describe it. Another thing that's important to note is that abundance is not just a policy orientation. It is an entirely new axis for political thinking, but one that does not map squarely onto the whole idea of what counts as left-wing or what counts as right-wing. You see, the old left-right divide would often be one where the left would push for a bigger and more centralized government, and the right would push for a smaller, more decentralized government, more deregulation, and so on and so forth. But abundance doesn't really map neatly onto any of that. It cuts orthogonally across that left-right spectrum. Abundance is not about how big the state should be. It is about how capable it can be. And that brings us to one of the core ideas of this episode, which is state capacity. Because as it turns out, you can't build more housing or energy infrastructure or transit and so on and so forth if the government can't get anything done. Today's guest argues that our own government has essentially regulated itself through the use of so many different cumbersome laws and regulations. It's essentially regulated itself into paralysis. And as a result, the government often can't deliver on its own promises. And to Steve, this is a crisis not just of governance, but a crisis of legitimacy. Because when the government can't deliver, people don't just lose faith in those specific institutions, they lose faith in democracy itself. So we talk about how to rebuild that capacity, not by ripping up regulations just for the sake of it, but being very intentional about how to create a government that actually knows how to execute. Here's my conversation with Steve Teles. Hope you enjoy. Steve Teles, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Excited to do that after all of your illustrious previous podcast guests.
Yeah, well, don't mention it. I think the first thing that I would like to ask you is, you were at an abundance conference very, very recently. There were plenty of really interesting people like Marshall Kozlov, Jerusalem Dempsis, etc. Paint a picture for me about how it felt and like the impression that you got away from it with.
Yeah, so this is the second year that we being the group of different think tanks and activist organizations that are part of Abundance, have done one of these national conferences. We did it in DC last summer, and now we're doing it again. And this one was just so much bigger than the one last time. Last time it felt like me and my friends got together, and like some other guys came over too, and they brought some beer, and that was like, that was it. Whereas this time, it was 500 people in a huge ballroom. So I gave one of the keynote speeches at the beginning of the conference, and I stood up, and I don't know how many of your listeners will know this, but when you give those things, they have unbelievable lights, like lights that you've never been in, and they're like right in your eyes. So you actually can't see the audience, and so you can't get any like feedback. And so for me, that was good because I wasn't constantly being faced with the fact that I was talking to a crowd of like 500 people, and every one of the tables was full. And so part of it did feel like this thing had really come out as an actual thing going on in the world, right? People were paying attention to us. There was media around. Some people on the outside didn't like us and were writing negative articles about how we're a conspiracy, right? That's the kind of thing that people don't do when you're just on the DL, right, out there, right, when nobody's paying attention to you. So part of it is, right, there were, some of it with the writers, like the people you mentioned, but also, there was a whole panel of people who were state legislators who were doing stuff in particular on housing, right? There were members of Congress talking about trying to pass bills for permitting and transmission. So it's a mix, and there were like, obviously, as there always are in these, there were the people from YIMBY out there talking about the work that they were doing on housing. And, when you see that, you see the kind of breadth of people that this is bringing in. And the thing I would say as a last word on this, I met a young woman who's a city council member in Washington State who read my Varieties of Abundance essay that maybe we'll talk about later, and said, that I have all these different categories of abundance, and one of them is called Cascadian abundance. And she wrote me a message back saying, "Oh my God, I finally feel seen." And then she started a Substack on the idea of Cascadian abundance. And so I feel like we're in this thing where there is a kind of flywheel where we're meeting each other, and now we actually know each other, and people are getting inspired to do stuff that they wouldn't do if they weren't part of some project of collective action. And so that was sort of the vibe that came out of it for me.
Yeah, so to be that obnoxious guy in the back of the class who always makes some kind of algebra metaphor, imagine how like a graph of y equals x squared is the sort of thing where like after x becomes sufficiently large, the amount by which y increases just becomes exponentially larger.
Yeah, I mean, I would, you can use whatever metaphor you want. I always say that I'm an exceptionally bad math person. My brother got all the math in our family, but it's definitely the case that one feature of a successful kind of social movement is it releases a lot of previously slack resources, right? So there are people who just, who were smart, who were having thoughts sitting in their room, right? But they weren't part of anything and didn't think of doing anything. And so now there's a thing to join. They think that if they do something, there'll be an audience for it. There's other people who, when people do things, can then kind of signal boost for them. So I'm doing that. Hopefully we'll put her Substack in your notes, right?
Yeah, I'll leave it in the show notes just for the sake of it.
But, that's one of the things that happens when people start creating collective action is it does have that kind of cumulative, as you were saying, exponential quality, because people are building, this is also the way social networks work, right? Once you have a few kind of different nodes in a social network that connect up, suddenly all kinds of things that were not connected before suddenly get connected. And you could see that like just in the meeting. And the other thing I'll say is, there's a lot of diversity in this movement, right? And that's one of the things that felt so different and so in a way countercultural to the moment we're in. is this is a weird movement, and then it includes people over a pretty long span of ideological space, at least on the standard American ideological spectrum. And they were not talking about each other, they were talking to each other. And I think a lot of the problems we have in the United States, certainly are in other parts of the world as well, are the problems of people talking about people who are not themselves present, right? Whereas here, we were actually arguing with each other, but arguing with each other within the context of thinking that we're also building something together.
I think it's so fascinating just how much abundance has taken off over the past, like, compared to like a year ago, and like especially over the past 6 months, it's just been astronomical, the degree to which the abundance movement has just gained so much more traction. But let me backpedal a little bit, because I haven't really been talking much about abundance on this podcast so far. So how about you paint a scene for the audience? Try to describe not just what abundance is, but like the problems that it's trying to solve. Because like there are so many problems in America these days where I would like for you to like walk the audience through what specific economic problems, what specific technological problems are present within American society right now, and how does abundance plan to address those specific problems?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is the way that I usually try and explain it, is we have a lot of problems, right? A lot of them are about the cost of the most fundamental goods that help people make up a decent life. Housing, healthcare, transportation, energy, all of those are the real fundamentals, and they all face some very significant supply constraint, right? The prices are what they are, and people are fighting over artificial scarcity because somebody put something in the way, right? It wasn't just a fact of physics or nature, right? And so when I think about what makes abundance, right, the first is the idea that we're trying, not to the exclusion of other kind of ways, but certainly as a very important first step, trying to solve problems through more supply, right? So rather than trying to find ways to divvy up a fixed pot, we're trying to increase the size of the resources that we have. And another way for that is just to say productivity, right? We're trying to get more out of what we've already got.
Can I make an analogy, and then let me know if you think this analogy works? So
it's how podcast, so you can do whatever you want.
All right, sure, yeah. I was asking that as a courtesy, and if you said no, I would have been rude, and I would have done it anyway. So you know how in a long time ago, people thought that like the population needed to go down because of like Malthusian economics of like, we don't have enough resources to provide for everyone in the world, so we are going to have to make sure that the population doesn't grow to a certain amount. But then none of that came to pass, because it turns out that like all of the resources that we thought were scarce, if we improve technology, if we improve productivity, that meant that we could like grow population, but allow resources to not be scarce, and we could still allocate resources so that everyone could be able to afford them because of how much productivity, how much technological advancements have improved what we could actually do with those resources. So maybe there's something similar in abundance, where there are certain resources where right now we're sort of locked in a zero-sum mindset of like, we can't afford to feed everyone, we can't afford to house everyone, we can't afford to like provide energy to everyone. But the truth is, we can do things like build more or advance like technology a lot more, or we can advance productivity a lot more, so that all these conflicts that we think are zero-sum, where we can't afford to help everyone, in the future maybe we can afford to help everyone, and we're just looking at the problem in the wrong way.
Yeah. So like, the most obvious way to think about this is, the Chinese in the late 70s were sitting around saying, oh, we've got a real problem. We don't have enough to feed everybody. What if we actually, just forcibly told everybody they could only have one kid, right? Well, that didn't work out great, and it's turning out to have all kind of negative consequences now. But the real thing is they found out that actually Chinese were capable of being massively more productive than they were. Now they're finding out that they're like, oh my God, we really actually need more kids now. So now they're in the opposite problem, but they had entirely misdiagnosed the problem. They had diagnosed the problem as trying to suppress demand rather than increase supply. And then Deng Xiaoping, right, and Chinese figured out a way actually that by re-engineering the state, re-engineering the economy, giving people more, unlocking things that create productivity, it actually turned out that they could produce unimaginably more than they had in 1979. So I think that's a good example of trying to think about these things from a scarcity as opposed to an abundance mindset.
So I guess like abundance is trying to solve all of these problems where we think that they are scarce, but in reality, we can just tweak productivity, we can tweak technological advancement so that everyone can just afford a greater share of the pie, where we're not trying to divvy up the same pie. It turns out that we can actually like grow more pies, and that way everyone can have larger slices. But what does that encompass? Does that encompass like housing? Does that encompass clean energy? Like what are some more tangible like societal problems that we're trying to like increase the pie for everyone about?
Yeah, so let me go back just 1 second, right? So abundance is not just about the goal, right? It's not just about that we have this goal of increasing, increasing supply through productivity. But most people who are involved in abundance, no matter what variety they're in, believe that scarcity comes from effectively two sources, right? One is that there are anti-productivity coalitions, right? There's somebody, the old saying on this is that, everything that's like, inefficiency is also somebody's mortgage payment, right? So somebody's benefiting from this, right? I think about this often in schools, right? There's lots of terrible rules that schools in the United States have about hiring and firing teachers and what do you teach and all those other things, right? And I can say, these are all important for explaining why productivity is so low. But that's also how a number of people like pay the rent. And so part of this is both diagnosing where those anti-productivity coalitions are, and importantly, and this is the part of the democratic part of abundance, right? Trying to create forms of counter organization, countervailing power, right? So this is the thing why I always keep mentioning the YIMBYs and why I'm so inspired by them, right? Is that they realize that if they could not get people to get off their couch and show up at planning meetings and say, like, we need more housing, right? So that the only people showing up at planning meetings were not like existing homeowners who were getting there and saying, there's going to be more traffic. I don't like it, right? That, showing up is 90% of life, right? And that's certainly true in politics. But to do that, you need collective action. And so part of abundance is creating new forms of collective action that allow us to rebalance imbalanced forms of participation. And then the other part, and I think of the abundance triangle, abundance at the top, then, countervailing power is at one corner, and then the other corner is state capacity, right? That actually unlocking productivity, making big things happen doesn't just happen through deregulation, right? It happens through forms of collective action that we have to do through the state. And sometimes that's about creating new forms of state capacity. So I think about, when you think about charter schools in the United States, you could think about them as like a deregulatory thing, that we're creating new schools. They're not regulated as much as existing schools, but they also involve new forms of state activity, right? So now there's charter authorizers. That's a new thing government wasn't doing before, and they have to decide who gets in, who goes back out, right? And if that thing doesn't work, then that market that's designed to produce more productivity isn't going to work either. So abundance is unlocking supply, countervailing power, and state capacity.
Would you say that abundance is more focused towards like giving local governance more funding, or being more reliant on the private sector?
Neither. Period. Okay, I'll give you a longer answer then. I think we differ on that question. So when you think about the old distribution, right, the old ideological left-right spectrum, the old left-right spectrum is very defined by size of government, centralization. So the left is for more government, more centralized. The right is for less government, more decentralized. And that's not our spectrum, right? So I think of abundance as being a dimension that cuts across that left-right dimension, right? That's not really defined by that. So let me give you the example in healthcare, which is a good way to think about it, right? So the traditional right in healthcare wants more of the cost of healthcare put on the balance sheet of individual families, right? So they want them to be paying, individuals to be paying more of that. And the left wants to put more of the cost on the public balance sheet. And that's what people were arguing about, right? So people on the left wanted single payer, Bernie Bros wanted single payer, and like Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House, right, he wanted more stuff where people were paying for more of their healthcare. That's not what abundance is about. And part of the abundance argument, and Sam Hammond and Daniel Takish and I made this argument in a piece that we put out through the Niskanen Center called Cost Disease Socialism, that right now, one of the problems in American politics is that neither the left or right can get what they want, right? So the right can't get more healthcare costs onto people's individual balance sheets because the costs are just too much for ordinary people to bear, right? If they had to pay them, they wouldn't be able to pay for healthcare. They'd be furious and they'd try and put it back into the public, right? But we actually can't get the single payer either because the underlying costs of doctors and hospitals and technology and everything are also too high. And so if the government tried to digest all of those healthcare costs, they would just get a tummy ache and wouldn't be able to do it, right? And so in order to unlock what either the left or right wants, we have to find some way to solve the underlying out-of-control cost drivers, which, again, go back to what I was talking about before, right? We have all of these anti-competitive, anti-innovation blockages in the system, like the system by which we license new doctors, or we allow doctors from other countries to come into the United States, the way we let nurses do practice or create new sort of forms of healthcare, right? Unless you deal with that, you can't go either direction. I think that explains a lot of the frustration in our politics over the last few years, is that both the left and right want to go in places that they can't really go because the underlying supply condition is kind of locking them in place.
I'm going to quote something that you said about state capacity in one of your other pieces from Niskanen, the one about varieties of abundance that I believe you mentioned earlier. Quote, "An effective state requires a certain level of bureaucratic autonomy, which is the space that state actors have to create capacities and organizational culture and perpetuate them over time to generate performance-based authority. Rather than constraining states through a morass of procedure, abundance advocates typically seek to authorize it through regular, predictable achievement of results," end quote. So basically, is abundance, like the goal of abundance is to basically get rid of government bureaucracy to focus on results. Is that correct?
Not to get rid of government bureaucracy. So we've got to be very careful here, right? Because remember, the left-right distinction, the traditional left-right distinction is that the left wants more bureaucracy, more government, and the right wants less. Right? Whereas the abundance approach focuses on state capacity, right? And state capacity is not the same thing as size, right? It's not the same thing as headcount. It's not the same thing as funding, right? It's about capacity, right? And that capacity is in part about bureaucratic culture, right? It's about how you take whatever resources you got and you knit them into organizations that are actually capable of having esprit de corps, so like many people in the abundance world, somewhat controversially, look around and they say, look, Singapore, right, will pay their senior bureaucrats an extraordinary amount of money, right? In order to attract people who are as good as the people who are at the very top of the private sector in Singapore, right? And as a result, they have senior leadership that also those other sectors that they're regulating respect, right? And again, but they also equip those bureaucrats with the ability to actually manage the organizations they have, whereas we tend to try and govern bureaucracy by increasingly ratcheting up the restrictions that we put on them, right? What they can do, how they can order things, how they can, do all these things that produce public value. But in the end, nobody really thinks that you can get people to do creative things that produce value by multiplying the number of rules they have to face. And the result of that is what you end up getting is what people call a compliance mentality, right? Rather than being focused on what you're trying to produce, you're focused on the fact that the way you're going to get in trouble is by breaking one of those thousands of rules that you're facing, right? And so that's what I think is the best way to think about this, right? We're trying to sidestep the question of bigger or smaller, right? So my friend Tyler Cowen wrote a famous piece called State Capacity Libertarianism. And he was saying, look, to get to a freer, more deregulated world, we need maybe a smaller number of bureaucrats, but ones who are better resourced, are given more freedom to innovate. And that's just not a kind of position that makes sense in the old left-right spectrum.
Do you think that abundance-heavy policies that obviously it's not necessarily that there's a larger head count of government servants, but more that government bureaucrats have much more autonomy. They have much more freedom to use creative ends to achieve the goals and results that they're tasked with achieving. If the net result is a government that is far more efficient and less reliant on regulation, do you think that stands a chance of making authoritarianism much more efficient in the future? Because of authoritarians who want to weaponize the government won't actually get held back by all of the regulations, the the quintessentially American regulations that have traditionally held back people from being successfully authoritarian in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I get a lot. So first of all, I'd say, it is the case that when we think about deregulation, the first place we think about deregulating is deregulating the public sector, right? So again, to go back to the old left-right spectrum, the old left-right spectrum is the right wanted to deregulate and the left wanted to regulate the private sector, right? Whereas our position is that we've excessively regulated the public sector, right? We've created all these rules, many of which seem to make sense, but from the point of view of the bureaucrat who's actually tasked with doing something, right? Building a subway, creating new sewers, you think about, educating children, performing all of those constraints does not aggregate up to the creation of public value, right? That you got to produce public value through some other kinds of means. But when there's all those rules, and that's the way that you can most get in trouble, you can get sued, you can get pushed by by an auditor, you can get pulled up to Congress, and they ask you, why didn't you follow all of the rules, right? Though the kind of people who get drawn into government are going to be people who are oriented toward compliance, right? So there's a selection mechanism there, right? People who are into moving fast and doing things and experimenting and testing and all that kind of stuff.
Move fast and break stuff, as one notable person may have said very recently.
Well, I would move fast and make stuff, right? That's my my kind of thing. So anyway, yeah, right. So one is, again, now I have a different theory about how this authoritarianism thing fits in here, which is that, we have all these constraints out there now, right? they do not seem to be stopping this current administration from just doing whatever they want, right? At some point, you can just be like, you know what? I'm just not going to do any of it, and you can just, try and stop me, but I have all the tanks, right? So hold on one sec. Hold on one sec.
All right, fine. You could finish your thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Finish my thought. So one, I don't think it seems to be stopping it, but my theory of authoritarian populism is it is in part a reaction to the inability of government to solve problems, right? That through normal liberal democratic means, government keeps saying it's going to do this, and it doesn't work. It makes promises it can't deliver on, and eventually that opens up the way for authoritarian populists to say, if I throw out everything and just have one man rule, right, then we'll be more efficient. Now, it turns out one man rule doesn't produce efficiency either, right? But I do think that tends to be behind a lot of those populist kind of messages. The last thing I'll say, like, if you look at the ads the Reform Party, which is the populist party in Britain, had last time, the first thing that the leader of the Reform Party went out and said is, nothing works anymore. And I think that is the thing that's like lurking in the background of a lot of that authoritarian message. And the better way to do this, the liberal democratic way to do this, is to figure out new ways to hold bureaucrats responsible that don't involve the multiplication of constraints that ends up making it impossible for them to produce value and then produces reaction.
All right. So I think there are two angles to approach like government bureaucracy and authoritarianism. So the first angle would be like, to what extent is like the lack of state capacity, to what extent is that one of the structural factors that led to a rise in like authoritarian or autocratic impulses in like US politics? And then the second thread is like, to what extent is that currently impeding present day authoritarianisms from enacting their full agenda? So I think that on question one, I'm a lot more sympathetic to your point. I'm a lot more sympathetic to the idea that like government not being able to get things done is what allowed like demagogues to come in and sort of say that like I need to like seize power in order to, because that way I'll actually be able to do X, Y, Z. I'm very sympathetic to that. But I think that question is completely distinct from how to actually get out of this mess that we are like in the middle of it, if that makes sense. Because I think one thing that I might actually disagree with you about is that I do think a lot of the state incapacity and a lot of the bureaucracy is constraining Trump a lot more than he otherwise would be constrained. And I think that this is especially apparent during his first term, where I think a lot of Trump's more authoritarian impulses were prevented from succeeding because of how vast the web of American bureaucracy was. And obviously he's more successful this term, but I would argue that like he is prevented from being even more successful because of how many regulations there are within the American government. Would you accept my premise?
I would not.
All right.
Okay, so here's why, right? Now, again, nobody here is saying that like we shouldn't have a legislature, right? Or that we shouldn't have laws, right? The question is, what kind of laws and what's the way the legislature should hold the executive accountable? So I do think there's something weird when an executive branch thinks it can just eliminate a department that has been authorized and funded by the legislature. Right now, look, there are problems with the ways that we create appropriations for government agencies, right? The fact that we do appropriations annually, even for like large capital projects in the federal government, creates all kinds of nightmares, right? And we should really be thinking about trying to change, people have talked for a long time about things like biennial appropriations that would give agencies a lot more time to, actually work on projects without going right back to the annual appropriations cycle again, right? That's different than saying the executive branch should be able to spend money on whatever or not spend money on whatever it wants, right? That really is lawless. So the way I think about it, one thing I did at Niskanen Center, and that there's people following up, was on this idea of what is a law of abundance, right? What does law look like? So there's been a lot of people in the abundance space, like my friend Nick Bagley, who wrote this famous essay called The Procedure Fetish, who have been saying, one of the problems is we just have too much law, right? We just are choking on the amount of law that we have, and that we need to think a little differently about how, public value and safety and accountability actually work. Because one problem is when you multiply the amount of law, you may actually reduce the overall amount of constraint, because then inevitably bureaucrats have to pick and choose between various constraints that they can't all do simultaneously.
So
right?
to paraphrase The Incredibles, like if everything is a law, then at some level nothing is. Is that the point that you're making?
Well, you should always quote The Incredibles because it's awesome. But yeah, I mean, I do think that inevitably ends up creating, what you really want out of law is a reasonable degree of determinism, right? So like people know what it is that's going to happen, right? So again, this goes all the way, back to the founders, right? The founders say like and this is, that lots of people have dependence on things that law does, right? People make investments on the assumption that they kind of know what the law is going to be, right? People make all kinds of other decisions in their life based on that, right? But once you multiply the amount of law sufficiently, it's no longer giving you that determinism. And then, right, then you're in a world in which lots of things that actually would create a lot of value don't come in because people don't know what's going to happen, right? And again, that goes back to the state capacity. In fact, you actually need a pretty fair amount of state capacity to produce that determinism, right? You need, like people often tell me, one of the problems in India is they don't have sufficient capacity in their courts. So decisions take forever. Anybody can get in. And as a result, right, it's really hard to write contracts. It's hard to do market relationships. And that's one of the reasons why they often have these very large corporations in India, is they have to bring a lot of things inside the firm that ideally you'd be doing through contracts, but then you'd need to have judges and courts and stuff to do.
So your argument is essentially that like there are so many laws that eventually some of the laws become meaningless. And like as a result, people have to be kind of judicious in terms of which laws they follow more slavishly than others.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably true, right? That you, at some point, once again, a small number of law, the ideal of liberal democratic government is a small number of laws highly certainly imposed, right? And that's certainly not what we've got now. And it becomes hard to actually do oversight if you're the legislature, right? If you've sent an enormous number of commands to your bureaucracy, right? Those laws are only as good as your system of oversight, where you can actually check to see whether people are doing it, right? But we have so many now that there's impossible for the legislature to do that, or to have enough space in its agenda to come back. Now, the other thing we should talk about is, liberal democratic government depends on a legislature that actually wants to be a legislature, right? And this is one of my disappointments of our current period is the American Congress does not seem like it particularly wants to be a legislature, right? They are acting like, well, the Trump administration is doing all this stuff, but what are we going to do? I'm like, you could pass some laws. If you don't like it, like there were a bunch of people when RFK Jr. got confirmed, who you could tell, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, who was like, this guy is a kook, right? He's going to be horrible. Bill Cassidy could have just voted no. He could have just said, this guy's a kook, and I don't think we should confirm kooks, so there you are, right? But this Congress seems like it doesn't want to get up on its hind legs and even preserve its most minimal kind of prerogatives. And so I don't think you can count on courts and law to do what legislatures are unwilling to do.
Yeah. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit, because we've talked a lot about abundance and the function that it has on government. But all of this, like all of these debates, a lot of these are premised on the assumption that we can get abundance-like policies, whether they have to do with housing, whether they have to do with infrastructure, clean energy, etc. A lot of this is premised on the idea that we can get these policies passed within the legislature, and that's reliant on the American people actually being okay with it. But I do think that there's a lot of discussion that I'm very sympathetic to about the idea that even if abundance is good on the merits, it is very politically unpopular. And examples of this would be like there are plenty of studies, I can link one of these in the show notes, that show that the vast majority of Americans don't believe that building homes will reduce the cost of rent, even though YIMBYism and increasing housing supply is one of the core aspects of the abundance agenda. So what do you think about the idea that you guys might be sort of ignoring or hand-waving away just how electorally unpopular a lot of these policies are?
Yeah. So one, I should say a little bit about the abundance theory of change. So part of it we talked about before is about countervailing power, right? You actually have to organize people. And this is the thing that I think people often misunderstand is, some of politics is technocratic, right? Some of it is about getting new forms of evidence before decision makers. And that's certainly important. And that's, at Niskanen Center, where I'm a fellow, we do a lot of that kind of work. And part of it is about actually showing that there are mobilized populations who care about things and not just concentrated groups who are likely to get crushed by it, right? And so, one, I do think part of our job is going out and persuading people, right? It's not just taking public opinion as it is, but trying to change it, to get people to understand where the roots of their problems are. So, for example, like when you poll people, they definitely say housing costs are a big problem. But when you ask them, like, what are they in favor of to do something about it, right? They're more likely to say things like rent control, right? Price controls, right? And that's true of lots of things. It's true in energy, and that's, in my mind, because, most people don't understand how large, complex systems work. That's just a fact, right?
They view the world as a lot more zero-sum than policymakers like us would view the world.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think they're again, this is part about training, right? It takes a long time. This is not because like you've got a higher SAT score than normal or I do or whatever, right? It's partially just about how you train people. It takes a long time to learn to think systemically, right? To think about, large social outcomes is produced by complex multi-causal systems, right? So you want to know, like, why is the rent so high, right? I can tell you a story about how it's about the incentives for people to put new supply on the market and how that relates to the decision-making of landlords and owners and people. I could go into all that, right? But you need a lot of like mental architecture to do that. And that's true of almost any other kind of social outcome, right? Whereas, if you're like, the people who did this are bad and we need to constrain them and make them do something good, right? Well, then you've got a really small causal chain that resonates with people. And again, it's because people tend to think morally more than they think analytically. They think about problems as produced by bad people rather than bad systems. And it takes a while to educate people and get them to think in those terms, and again, to organize around that. And again, that's finally is the amazing thing the YIMBYs did, is they were able to get out there and say, high housing costs are produced by constrained supply, right? So they're at least implicitly making an argument about how some system works. And again, that's why for people like me, they were so inspiring. And the question is, can you do that over and over again? Can you figure out what the problematic, constrained system is and get in there and rewire it while also explaining that to large publics? And that's difficult, but I also think that's democratic practice.
This is the part of the podcast where I use what you just said as an excuse to pat myself on the back a little bit. Because when we first started trying to explain abundance to our audience, I did not try to approach it by immediately asking you for the technical aspects or like the effect that it has on the economy. I tried to get you to explain the end goals that you're trying to achieve. Because I think that a lot of the time, the average American voter, it's a lot easier to get them on board with something if you sell them the destination rather than the vehicle. And I think that if I were to extend this metaphor, I think a lot of the time people who are talking about abundance, they do a very good job talking about the vehicle. But like the end goal that we should be selling to people is the destination of like, at the end of the day, there are going to be more houses and houses are going to be more affordable. And as a result, you're going to feel a lot safer and you're going to feel like your life has a lot more stability. Or like energy costs will go down and like poverty will go down, yada, yada, yada. And then like those are the end goals. And then we can sell to people like the psychological effect, the psychological positive effect that it will cause them to help, like that'll allow them to feel safer, that'll allow them to trust their neighbors more, et cetera, et cetera. Because like that's the destination that our vehicle is going to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on this is, part of how people change their minds is not that like some guy in the center writing in the New York Times writes something and then it all like filters down, right? People get persuaded by people sitting in bars, having beers and talking to people, right? And I think that's one of the things when you think about like, this goes back a little bit to your earlier theory of like, change, and you were like running some algebra bias. And, when there's like a kind of horizontal mechanism there where ordinary people are listening to Andrew's podcast and getting the message, right? Now, that's how any evangelical movement works, right? It's not just there's one guy in the front who's doing everything, right? But that people hear it, they hear the good word, right? They want to be, again, I hate to use this, but my favorite line from Scripture is where Jesus says that he's a fisher of men, right? And he says, look, I am bringing you to be fishers of men. I think that's the job, is to go out there. And again, that's part of how a democratic, free society changes its mind, is people go out there and they say, I got so excited by this idea, I'm going to go and tell all my friends. And then they're going to tell all your friends. And again, you can do the math about how quickly that can change things.
Yeah, like when Jesus said, like you will become fishers of men, he was trying to sell people on the outcome and not the mechanism by which to achieve the outcome. I think that like all of us, like the people who are so like enamored with like abundance policies and like what will be best for the economy, what will be best to make housing more affordable, what will be best to make clean energy more affordable. We're doing a really, really good job improving the mechanisms. But like at the end of the day, like alongside the growth in the abundance movement, we need to find people that are better at like selling the end goal to people, because that is the reason why we're doing abundance in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say before I go on this is that people need to believe. They need to believe that there is, that there can be a better future, right? That, again, I was looking at this thing people were writing about varieties of different climate activists. And it was going from sort of technological futurists who were imagining, things that were like taking solar power from space and then sending it out. And then doomers, and the doomer category had like somebody like very sad with their head in their hand, right? And obviously being a doomer is bad. It's sad. It makes people feel bad, and it makes them do things that are not productive or that are violent because they can't imagine an actual plausible way to get to something that's better. And that's what I think ultimately that matters a lot about the abundance movement is the vibes of it, right? It is the fact that actually this is a optimistic, problem-solving kind of movement, and it's a democratic movement. It says, look, we can do this together. We can do this by working with people who are not like us, right? Who are in all those ways. And that's why I like, especially at this moment we're in it's the precisely the countercultural quality of abundance that should make it so attractive.
All right, final question. I think we've talked quite a bit about how abundance is like a mechanism for an end goal, and an end goal is there to help people to achieve a different psychological state. So an example would be how, like, a lot of the time, like, policy wonks like us, we would describe poverty as like people making like below a certain threshold of income within the income distribution or whatever. Whereas people who are actually poor, they would describe poverty in like psychological terms. They would describe it as like a feeling of hopelessness or a lack of agency or like a lack of self-worth. So like when you try to sell them on anti-poverty measures, you would appeal to their, like, to the psychological feeling that they have, that you will feel a greater sense of agency, you will feel a greater sense of self-worth, et cetera, et cetera. Now, abundance, we're trying to solve for problems like housing, like clean energy, et cetera, et cetera. And like those, and we're trying to have mechanisms to achieve certain end goals. But like at the end of the day, what psychological feeling, what emotion are you trying to get people to feel with abundance?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to put it is agency, right? That people don't just think that they're the passive recipient of things that can't change, right? But part of it is not just agency, but I would put it as collective agency. The idea that, we individuals working with other people are capable of actually making things different. And that we don't always have to wait around for somebody else to do something. And this is why, again, to go back to my, friend who was out there in Washington State, right? She's out there doing something. She didn't wait for somebody else to go and save her. She's going out trying to find the other people like her who want to work on problems, who want to understand them, who want to figure out where the levers are. And that, again, that's collective agency, right? The idea that only by working with other people are we capable of solving all the problems that we need. And that, working with other people, this goes back to the general psychological state, is pluralist work, right? To change things, we need to work with people who are often different than us, right? Who want something, maybe the same thing, but for very different reasons. I'll give you a last example before we finish up, which is I've been thinking a lot about what are the kind of housing options that allow people with very traditional religious worldviews and often very left of center experimental views to both get what they want, right? And one problem is right now, the homogeneity of the kind of things we build make it hard for either one of them to get what they want, right? But that, working pluralism is finding out how we can find the same thing, the same remedy that can solve often very different problems that people face. And that's, to me, what really democratic practice is.
Steve Teles, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.